Jai Hind, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Adi. I have someone really special today. Miss Maria Beat, who's a Russian affairs commentator and author, and as a matter of fact, a writer about various different issues concerning Russia. Currently based in Turkey, she also looks at the Turkish-Russian relationship in very minute detail. Thank you so much, Maria, for joining me to discuss what's happening in that part of the world.
Well, the pleasure is absolutely mine, Aadi. I'm very happy to be with you today.
Thank you so much. I'd like to, of course, this war in Ukraine is basically taken over the news waves. Every day there is an incident or the other, which, takes off everything apart from a logical discussion of actually what's happening on the ground. But I want to ask you, and this is something which is not spoken about as much, especially in the Western media. What do Russians actually feel about this war? What is happening? What is the talk within Russia? And what do you think Russia is going to do in the next couple of days or couple of weeks for that matter?
Well, any war, it's quite a sad development. And honestly, a year ago, um, I'm originally Russian, so I have many contacts and friends and close relatives living in Russia, in Moscow. So we were talking a lot about either there would be an open conflict, and nobody actually believed in that. And we were talking about the potential conflict because Americans were very active. American news media was covering intensely the topic of Russia unleashing war against Ukraine, and nobody believed in that. Everybody was saying this is typical propaganda. Why should we go to war with Ukraine? They're our brothers. We're the Slavic nations. So when it happened, people were shocked, largely shocked, and of course, many took the things going on there very close to heart and were very unhappy with military activities. As we look at the situation today, people are still largely unhappy. But on the other hand, now the spirits prevail. We should definitely win this war. Russia can't be the loser in this war. And it's a kind of Russian patriotism, which is something very typical for Russian people. They care about their country and what their country is doing. It's a must to render support. That's why there are many volunteers to join the volunteer forces in Ukraine on the Russian side. I think you've heard about the latest developments in Ukraine as of last week. The so-called private military company Wagner, they gained a major victory in Ukraine. So it gained a lot of support in Russia. It's very actively discussed. But if you look at what people think in general, we can't say that there is a so called united front to support the Russian activities in Ukraine. Yes, there are those who say we should definitely win, we should contribute every effort, we should support by 100% our government. We're on the side of what Putin and his commanders are doing. But there are others, and largely the so called Russian intelligentsia, who say, well, every war is a bad thing to do. The war should be stopped immediately, regardless of conditions, because people are dying at that war. So, this is a very bad thing. Some of those were very vocal, and because of that, they left Russia. They lived in the Baltic countries nowadays, in Georgia or somewhere else, and many actually moved for living to Israel because there is a huge Jewish community in Israel, and they're quite vocal in expressing what they feel. So the attitude is far from homogeneous, and it won't be a united stand. This is apparent nowadays because people, especially people of arts, musicians, theater actors, mm, and others, they say in the open, this war is a bad thing. We do not support what the government is doing. The war should be stopped by 100% as soon as possible. Well, actually, this is, in brief, what people in Russia think about it.
The funny thing is, when you spoke about intellectuals, musicians, and people from art, I was kind of smiling because those are the people that normally, uh, in India as well, have a soft corner towards our adversaries and talk about talking to the adversary rather than kind of taking a harder stand and doing stuff like that. So that's that what you've described is a normal country, which Russia is not portrayed to be. Do the
Oh,
Russian people understand what is being said about them in the Western media?
well, Western media, honestly, I read a lot what the Western media is saying about what goes on in Russia. And things from the distance look very much different from what goes on in reality in Moscow. Because many Western journalists and so called office analysts just sitting on their desks and browsing on the internet, trying to pick up from internet whatever's negative is said about Russia. They say, oh, Russia is in a very bad state, economy is down, living standards are down, people are very, very unhappy. Actually, life in Moscow hasn't changed much. Yes, certain goods have become expensive, quite expensive, be it consumer goods or food products, but everything is still available. There is no shortage in anything in terms of consumer goods. So life goes the way it's been going on for many years since 1991. So there isn't a big change in living standards or living habits since February 24 last year. Uh, People do not speak much about what goes on in Ukraine. They are focused on other matters, many of them on private matters, and well, things are going on as the way they used to go.
That's interesting. What about before we get into the geopolitics of the game, I want to take your comment on the war situation as well. Big victory in terms of Solidar. There's talks about a cauldron being formed in another small town in the north called Siversk. We know of there was a report yesterday that talked about 27 battalions of Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut. Tells us the amount of effort that the Ukrainians are putting to defend that particular area, tells us the importance of that area. Now, speculation is that the Russians would go in with a big offensive. Do you personally see that happening, or do you see the war grinding on, going forward slow and steady?
Well, first of all, today the news were revealed that Bakhmut, which is very close to Solidar, has been seized by Wagner Group, the same military group that
Wow.
seized Solidar last week. It means the Russians are advancing. And these two cities, they're quite small, actually, in terms of population. For instance, Solidar, it's a small settlement before the military hostilities were unleashed. No more than 20,000 people lived there. In terms of Russia, it's a very small place, and I think in terms of India as well. But strategically, it's an important strategic point, and especially now in the context of military activities, because frankly speaking, the Russian military during the whole operation were not very successful in advancing. They were quite successful at the very start, And you remember, the rumors were active. They were about to seize Kiev, the capital, but then they left the vicinities of Kiev. They took Kherson in the south. They said, oh no, it's a part of Russia, it's Russian territory, but then they left it. And of course, it was very, very discouraging. So, this Solidar victory is the first victory gained since autumn, since retreating from Kherson. So, politically and in terms of motivating the military and the people in the country, it's an important achievement. So, it's too early to say that Russia has started a major advance. We could just say that slowly but surely the Russian military have started advancing, taking one village, one settlement after another. But they also say that today, in particular, when the news were revealed that Bakhmut, another small settlement close to Solidar, was taken. So after that, they started saying that they're building their headway, moving further on, and they're building a kind of base for major advance. This so-called major Russian advance is much talked about to come shortly. But they've been talking about that to happen since autumn, and it hasn't started yet. Some people say it's because the weather was too warm, and for military armor such as tanks and armored personnel carriers, it was difficult to move when the ground was not solid. Now it has frozen because frosts have come, so it's easier to move, and in terms of logistics, the Russians feel more comfortable. So they say the major offensive start is coming. Well, this is it. But others say that it's quite possible that a major Ukrainian offense is about to start. So there is no clear understanding what's going on, but it's clear that neither of the parties is about to stop. Nobody wants to really start talking peace, and both sides keep saying, "Oh, Putin is not serious. He's not serious for talking about peace settlement." For instance, today I read that Zelensky mentioned the day before when talking to the Davos meeting that I don't want to start talking peace with the Russians because I'm not sure that Putin is still alive. So there are all kinds of ridiculous statements made. And this is another negative thing to affect the whole process. And that's why hostilities, unfortunately, continue. And I'm afraid they will continue going like that for quite a while. What would be the end? The Russians definitely say we need to war. Putin is not the kind of person who would stop in the middle. He won't stop until he gains a victory. Well, it remains to be seen.
I think you brought out a very important point, which is, something that I've been actually talking about is the stupidity, and I'm sorry to use that word, of the rhetoric, uh, especially from the Ukrainians. They're very hard fighters. I have very good respect, very high respect for the soldiers. They've been fighting a very, very uphill battle, and they've been doing whatever best they can. I mean, but the government in Kiev doesn't seem to realize the reality, and which brings me to my next question. Uh, with the power and the military mathematics, as they say, the Russians have a clear advantage. Whenever this offensive does come in, one can see with the sudden capture of towns, there is a certain buildup of the speed. That's something that can be established at the moment. I don't know if it's a big offensive or not, but at the moment, you can see them kind of chugging forward at a little faster speed than they were before. This means that the inevitable decline of Ukraine as a viable country, viable state is near on the cards. They've got pretty much nothing left. People are running. without electricity, it's a sad state of affairs. That means the decline of Ukraine or the destruction of Ukraine is somewhere on the cards. With the inevitable outcome towards Ukraine, which will be, no matter what, a loss of the country itself. Forget the military for the matter. They've lost their population, they've lost their industry, they've lost their electricity, their infrastructure, they're setting half their country on the east, and so on and so forth. So it's a loss. What do you think will be the future of the proverbial great power, which is NATO? Uh, who now, actually, the defense minister of Ukraine came out and said that we are fighting NATO's war. So, what will be the future of NATO in case the inevitable defeat of Ukraine actually takes place?
Well, it's a very good question. I think myself quite often what would happen tomorrow, and sometimes I talk the matter over with the so called NATO supporting analysts. And sometimes I make them angry because I say, look, you're pumping weaponry into Ukraine. Sooner or later, the war would be over. And at the territory of Ukraine, regardless of its borders, there would be plenty of ex military. And as we know, it would be a big problem for them to come back to normal life after spending so much time at the front lines. Because there would be plenty of people who know very well how to kill, but who do not know how to live in
Give.
peace. And
Exactly.
that would be a big danger because the factor Ukraine is a European Union country these days. So inside the European Union, there would be a country with really dangerous people ready to fight who won't stop at anything. And we know that before joining the European Union, Ukraine most probably become a NATO member. So NATO will have in its ranks a country with really dangerous population. I don't think that the NATO command is fully aware of these potential aftermaths to happen. Whenever I ask this question to European analysts, they cut me short by saying, oh, this is the so called third level repercussions. We're not thinking or talking about that. We're talking about helping Ukraine to win the war against the Russian aggressor. Right. This is what's been happening today. But we also need to think about tomorrow, what will happen to NATO, because NATO looks to be quite in a crisis. Look at the Turkey NATO relations these days. When the decision was taken to accept Sweden and Finland, the better part of the NATO members were sure that, oh, it won't be a problem. Nobody would say no. So, to certain countries, it came as a surprise when Turkey said, wow, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, let's settle down with your harboring terrorists in Sweden. And then we will ratify the memorandum on Finland and Sweden joining NATO. And some people said, oh, that's no problem. We will solve the matter. It's just blah, blah, blah. Turkey is not serious. Turkey will ratify the memorandum immediately. And I remember talking to some Americans like in September, and some of them were surprised and said, huh, you say that Turkey has not ratified the memorandum. Are you sure about it? And I said, sure. And nowadays, it's quite a big problem because, on one hand, the decision is taken to accept Finland and Sweden as the coming NATO members. On the other hand, we are still waiting for Turkey's consent. And Turkey is very straight in saying, look, we have an issue with Sweden. And it's not a new issue because Sweden has been harboring terrorists and those who were supporters of the 2016 coup in Turkey in Sweden. So it's an open secret that after the abortive coup, many of those who were engaged in it ran immediately to Sweden, and Sweden took them and gave them refuge.
Yeah.
So it's quite a serious matter. How the matter would be resolved, it all depends upon the so called Western side, because Turkish position is very clear. So NATO is a big issue these days, and there are certain reforming, certain modification in its politics required in order to bring it back to good standing.
You mentioned something very interesting. You said that you discussed this with your NATO supporting friends. I wonder what they think about sending 14 tanks to face off with the Russian 1,000. Uh,
Well, in general, the Western position is we should help Ukraine as much as we can. I'm not sure they fully understand how many tanks would Ukraine require. But President Zelensky has mentioned recently that they would like to have 1,000 Leopard tanks, which is a lot because, as far as I know, in the world today,
they
there
aren't enough.
are in operation 3,000 Leopard tanks. So Ukraine wants to get one third of total Leopards. I don't think it's realistic that it's feasible. This 15 tanks, well, a good issue is to deliver them to Ukraine, considering that Russia keeps shelling the infrastructure to include generators, power transmission lines. The railroads are out of electricity. So they can deliver these things to the front line by railroad. But if the railroad is out of electricity, there is a big issue because of course they still have steam runners, but not many of them, because
Mhm.
the steam runner is a relic of the past. It works on coal. So logistics to deliver these tanks, even these 15 tanks, and Leopard are huge tanks. If I'm not wrong, it's 8 meters long, 55 tons weight. It's really huge. So you need a huge railroad platform. And I'm not an expert in military warfare, but I would expect that it would be quite difficult to deliver those vehicles by trucks. You need a huge platform. So I don't. I think it's more of just saying the things without properly realizing how to do these things and how much the contribution it would be for Ukrainian advance. But on the other hand, we need to be very open. It took Russians by big surprise how effective the Ukrainian military have revealed themselves. I don't know why, but the general trend in Russia was that Ukrainian army was not efficient, it was weak, and it won't take a big effort from Russians to win the war. So when Ukrainians started fighting so ferociously, and the advance became so effective, it was an unpleasant surprise for the Russians. I don't know, maybe these 15 Leopards would play an important role in one advance or another. It depends upon the Ukrainian commanders, how they plan their military warfare.
It's what you're saying is actually makes a lot of sense, but looking at the reality of what is happening to the Ukrainian army today, and as a matter of fact, the kind of cross connection of statements coming across. Now, Aristovich, who was fired, then it seems the entire internal ministry of Ukraine is gone. in a helicopter crash. The Russian telegram channels say that he was shot down. Either ways, I mean, there seems to be something fishy happening behind the curtains in Ukraine, and I'm not sure whether this whole show will last as much as a lot of the Westerners think that it will last. So that's just my opinion. I'd request you for yours.
Well, in regard to Arestovich, uh, he's an interesting personality. I was listening to what he was saying myself.
Yeah.
Some things are quite interesting. He is a quick minded, intelligent person, and sometimes his opinions were very interesting, to a certain extent, differing from the general opinion expressed by the Ukrainian authorities, that's for sure. He enjoyed a strong position due to personal relationship with Zelensky. So his leaving his position came as a surprise. Of course, they say that he made a grave mistake. Well, in the past, he also made certain mistakes, maybe not that grave as this one, but still, it went unnoticed and no reprimands were made. So everything kept quiet. I think there was a growing tension between Arestovich and the ruling elite, so to say. Uh, it's possible that there are ongoing frictions inside the Ukrainian elite, which would be just logical because the situation is really tense. And what will happen tomorrow? It's a difficult question to answer because the country is in a difficult situation, to put it mildly, like this. People are unhappy, and the way that things proceed gives a thought that things will not start developing positively very soon. I believe that this war could be ended by some kind of sophisticated agreement. I think it's not realistic to expect that one side will gain a victory over another side. And it's not the military might of Russia that would decide the situation at the front, or the military might of Ukraine with support of NATO. It's something different. Look, we're in the 21st century, and the a victory on the battlefield is not enough
Yeah.
to finish the war for good.
Political
Look at
victory.
Syria. So there should be contributed a very sophisticated diplomatic effort. And
Mm.
as we see right now, Ukraine and Russia can't resolve the matter directly. An intermediary, and a very mighty intermediary, is required to help the parties to come to terms and to establish peace for good.
Which brings me to where you are sitting, Turkey, Turkey, if I may, actually.
Yeah.
Uh, it's going to take some time to actually remember that word. If India changes its name today, I think the world will take another 2 years to remember it. So, pardon me, the audience sitting from Turkey, but uh, this country has tried to be, and especially Erdogan has tried to come to a point where he's positioned himself as a leader that could talk to both the sides. Of course, there are a lot of people talking to both the sides. There's French President Macron, who's losing a little bit of trust with the Russians. There's the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's spoken to both the sides and he's been in touch with both the sides. Um, President Erdogan has tried quite a bit. As a matter of fact, the initial negotiations when Boris Johnson came and rubbished everything, but that was all happening with a lot of help from Turkey. Uh, Here is a country which is also trying to get in loop with the Russians in terms of the gas hub, in terms of the Turk Stream pipeline, and this and that. It also sends weapons to Ukraine, and it also attacks Syria, which is a huge Russian interest. What's happening here? It's it's quite a paradox. Is he trying to get an upper hand and get importance somewhere to get his country back into shape, or what's his goal? I'm not able to kind of understand what the end game of President Erdogan is.
Well, it's a very interesting topic. And if we look at these Russian-Ukrainian situations in general, then it appears that the only world leader today who is on good terms with both Russia and Ukraine is President Erdogan. Believe it or not, uh, because of course, President Macron is trying to contribute to positive effort, but he's not on strong terms with Turkey. So that's the thing. With Ukraine, President Erdogan, for combination of reasons, he has a very close relationship with President Putin, and of course, the interactions in Syria have largely contributed into that and built a kind of special relationship between Russia and Turkey. We have to be very clear. Turkey and Russia, they are not strategic partners because, of course, they have a very strong cooperation, but they are so-called situational partners. And this is how the relationship in Syria goes on. Because if we look at Syria, there were certain conflicts happening between Russian and Turkish military. But regardless of conflicting situations, they always came to terms. And that was one of the greatest advantages the Turkey Russia relationship has revealed. And Putin himself has mentioned that a couple of times. I think this kind of cooperation interactions in Syria, they built a kind of very special relationship between Turkey and Russia. And nowadays, it gives President Erdogan a kind of free hand to talk to President Putin about the things going on in Ukraine. And no other world leader ha- has this kind of advantage. So, this is important. On the other hand, Turkey has been building close relationship with Ukraine. You're right. Turkey is supplying Ukraine with Bayraktars, the UAE produced in Turkey. And this is quite an advanced and efficient weapon. Well, surprising as it is, Russians are not talking much about that. And Russians sometimes are very tough, saying harsh words about those who are supporting Ukraine in military effort, but they don't say too many bad words, so to say, about Turkey supporting Ukraine. And of course, it gives President Erdogan a lot of advantage. And he uses this kind of advantageous position very smartly because he promotes himself as a contributor into potential peace settlement. And a couple of days ago, he mentioned that he has a kind of tentative plan that the conflict in Ukraine could be resolved by so called partial ceasefires. It uh, reminds me of the way the conflict in Syria was resolved. Remember, they established four demilitarized zone, and it became quite a successful effort. So the only zone that is still not resolved is Idlib. So a similar scheme could be applied to Ukrainian situation. So I think President Erdogan is quite serious and he has a kind of plan how to resolve the matter. And he talks on the matter with both President Putin and President Zelensky. On the other hand, he is using this so called situation as his trump card in the light of the coming elections. It was announced 2 days ago that elections will happen on the 14th of May, or 1 month earlier than it was announced before. But on the other hand, the 14th of May is a very special day because in 1950, on the 14th of May, the government of Adnan Menderes came to power. And Adnan Menderes is a very special person in Turkey, not only because he was hanged by the neck in 1961 when the military junta came to power, but because his coming to power finished monopoly of the pro-Ataturk parties being in power for many, many years.
Yeah.
And because he introduced certain reforming that were made by population with great support. To a certain extent, there are certain elements in the Erdogan's policy now present that were originally introduced by the Menderes government. So this is it if we talk about Turkey.
Interesting times. As a matter of fact, just before the war, Turkey was considered to be in a very, very bad condition economically, and 89, 90% inflation. Things were pretty bad, and now things seem to be kind of leveling out for Turkey.
Well, inflation is still very high. It's more than 80%.
Mhm.
And we all feel it badly, especially when you look at the food prices. And it's not a good thing to happen.
Of course, of
On
course.
the other hand, the support the country renders to Erdogan is really going on. Just recently, the opinion polls were revealed, and based on the results of opinion polls, more than half of the country supports Erdogan and his backer, the so-called MHP, the party of Bahçeli. So people still believe that whatever we have right now in terms of difficulties is something temporary. Things would start improving because this is what President Erdogan has been promising. Also, the talks are on the way with Russians to get a 25% discount for gas, pipeline gas coming from Russia to Turkey. And if this discount is granted, President Erdogan has promised to give discount to consumers who are using natural gas. And that would be a great thing to have because we spend a lot of money on gas. All the houses are heated by gas. 65% of gas goes for electricity production. So the government is working hard on making the general population in Turkey happy. And it's a very productive effort, regardless of still very high inflation. Economy works okay. Things are on the rise. I live in Istanbul. Residential construction is huge, which means that people are buying apartments. And if people are buying apartments, it means they have money. It means they work, they generate cash. So, regardless of inflation, this country is not in a bad position.
That's what it is, and a lot of people speculate that if he was not able to, get into the this entire game, he would have not been able to come up and resolve a lot of the things, because it's also the nation's confidence that kind of goes down, and that impacts the economy and impacts everything else. We see it. India sees it in its neighborhood in Pakistan. The economy is down, and the morale of the people is falling further. So that's actually affecting the economy even further. Of course, the Afghanistan Taliban situation, it's bad, but to a large extent, certain number of population are still pretty enthusiastic about their freedom, so it still survives, and It's amazing. So that courage within the people and the positive feeling within the people obviously makes a huge difference, and I think you brought it out pretty well. But I want to get back to Ukraine and ask you a simple little question. Ukraine before 1939 was not Ukraine. I mean, the part that is known as Ukraine today was a small little part somewhere in the north of, somewhere around Kiev and little bit Sumy, and that, that small little area was actually known as Ukraine. We've heard rumors that the Polish want to kind of take back their territory. They've been fighting with the Germans for the reparations, $1.3 trillion. The Hungarians have not really said anything, but we know the Hungarians have an old claim on southwestern Ukraine. The Romanians, in terms of Moldova and Transnistria, or Piednestrovia, as you would like to call it, uh, have that particular claim. A lot of analysts today speculate that the Polish mobilization of 200,000 troops and so on and so forth is a step in the direction of the factor that in case the Russians do go in for that offensive, Western Ukraine needs to be kind of, you know, stabilized by Polish troops and some other stuff here and there. What do you think is the possibility of something like that happening? I mean, dividing up already broken country would be terrible. But Europe, I mean, with all respect to people of Europe, but Europe borders do change every 100 years. So that's what kind of tells me that there is some sort of a possibility here. What do you think?
Well, it's a very interesting question you pose, and thank you for bringing this, because one of the major problems or the major issues at the bottom of the Russia-Ukrainian conflict is that Ukraine came as an independent Ukraine after the 1917 revolution in Russia. For centuries, it was a part of the Russian Empire,
Yeah,
and it was called Malorossia, which it could be translated as small Russia.
smaller
And
Russia.
it's really amazing because people who lived in Malorossia, they were considering themselves Russians. And you know why? Because whenever they would go out of the country, in their passport, it would be mentioned as citizen of the Russian Empire. So for those living in the West, people from Malorossia were Russians, and they were considered as Russians. The so called feeling on national identity started spreading up when Ukraine became a Ukrainian republic within the Soviet Union. And it was greatly motivated by the Soviet authorities at that time. Some people still say that Ukraine is a patchwork country because the so called heart of Malorossia was added by the Donbas territories in the 1920s
Mm.
when the Soviet Union was established. Because Bolsheviks thought, oh, these so called core Ukrainian territories, they need support of proletariat. That's why we need to add the Donbas areas to the pure Ukrainian territories. And then you're absolutely right. In 1939, after this so called Molotov Ribbentrop agreement, the territories of Poland and former Austro Hungary were added to Ukraine. So this is how the present Ukraine came into being. If you ask me, to my mind, this country needs to be a federation because all these so-called parts that were brought together, they are very different from each other, and it's a big challenge for a country ruler to keep them intact as a single country. In regard to Poland, Polish Ukrainian relations is something special. It's, some people say that Ukrainians are closer to Russians, others say they're closer to Polish by culture, by mentality. You may recall that last autumn there was an agreement signed between Ukraine and Poland. And based on this agreement, Poland received a really broad powers in Ukraine. For instance, Polish police has received the right to operate in Ukraine. Polish citizens received the right to be made judges in Ukraine. So basically, yes, I'm not ready to go into details of this agreement because I'm not that much focused on it. But I remember I was very much surprised because it was a kind of prerequisite for creating a kind of alliance between these two countries. I don't know what would be the next steps, but President Duda, he came to Kiev. He hugged President Zelensky. They kissed each other. They were both very happy that they managed to sign this agreement. But it's a kind of first step for unification of the countries. To what extent it remains to be seen. In regard to Hungary, yes, there is quite a substantial Hungarian population living in western Ukraine, especially in the vicinity of the Carpathian Mountains.
Yeah.
It's quite possible that Hungary would also claim its rights on these territories that used to be originally the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Right now, there is not much talking about that, but I think we need to wait for the peace settlement because then, within the European Union, discussions I expect to start what shall be done with these territories that originally belonged to Poland and Hungary. And of course, people living in Lviv, which was originally Polish, they would also have a saying either they want to consider themselves Ukrainian or Polish.
Yeah.
But it's, to use American terminology, the second level repercussion. We will still have to deal with that after the hostilities are put on standby.
Thank you for answering that. I'd request, my request to you is that I'd really like you to be regular so that we can analyze this particular conflict on my channel because you've given some very, very broad and very, very sane views that you normally don't hear from the Western media. We in India, I'd like to just mention this. We are very close to Russia. There's no question about it, but we are not for the war as per se. We've been talking about, settling down and getting because in a war like this is not in India's favor. Looking at the surrounding that India stays in. Uh, but having said that, that's what it is. We've stood by Russia in terms of what we could do and stuff like that, and that's something which is because it's I think looked at in India as a very very big reciprocal for what the Russians did, you know, with regards their help to India back in the day of the Soviet Union and back in the day when India had challenges on its borders. So that's something which is keeping both the countries pretty close by. Plus, I think in India, because India is a big receiver of misinformation and disinformation, there's a lot of people within India that have started questioning any narrative that comes from the West. So if in India there's a saying that if the West is pushing for something so hard, think about it very clearly because it's going to be all a lie. So that's something that I think a lot of us kind of analyzed right at the beginning and got into it, and we realized, oh God, this is a complete spin, if I may. And as Arestovich, who's Zelensky's prime advisor, his nickname was the Spin Doctor. I guess the entire narrative coming out of the West was also a absolute spin. And that's something that Indians realized right at the beginning. And if you look at a lot of the publications coming out of India, a lot of the writings, a lot of the, it's not pro Russian, but it's not, I mean, I'm not saying it's pro Ukrainian, but it's not anti Russian, right? So that there's a thin line that has been drawn. But I really appreciate you've taken the time and you've kind of dwelled into issues which are not spoken about. The whole Polish thing, which is absolutely kept under the rug. There's no official order as far as the mobilization is concerned. Nothing, it's just quiet. And of course, Ukraine is winning, and that's something that we've heard since the 24th of February. To the last thing I'd say that if Ukraine is winning, why hasn't it won till now? So it's something I really fail to understand. It's a sad story for the people in Ukraine. My heart goes out to them, uh, but that's the reality. And we haven't spoken about the whole nationalistic movement within Ukraine. We'll probably keep it for a next conversation to analyze in depth as to, because by then I think this whole offensive thing would open up. We'll come to know how far the Ukrainian society will actually accept what is happening to them. Maria, thank you so much once again. It's a great pleasure talking to you. Firstly, getting connected with you and talking to you and learning so much. Look forward to having your views and yourself on my platform more often. Till then, thank you once again.
Pleasure's absolutely mine. Have a very good day, sir. All the
Thank,
best.